Welcome to this breakout session of the SOSV Climate Tech Summit. But without further ado, I'll turn to our guest today and our co-host who are running this session. So the session is titled Powering the Future, Navigating the New Electricity Landscape. So I'm based in Portugal, land of solar energy. I'm from France, land of nuclear. Hampus and Fabian are based in Sweden, which is the land of, they will tell us what, and land of IKEA for sure, delicious breakfast and coffee. And then, as you know, there's a number of energy problems in Europe due to the conflict in Ukraine. So problems with gas, problems with electricity supply in general. In the US, there's also problems for various reasons, some of them related to climate, and some of them just linked to the need to decarbonize the grid, the need to also power the increasingly energy-hungry data centers that the big tech is building. So we'll see how much our guests will cover. So let me now turn to them. So first is Hampus Jakobsson. He's the co-founder and general partner at Pale Blue Dot, a very active European-based Swedish investor in climate tech, who also runs a fantastic conference, by the way, which I highly recommend. That just concluded, but you can probably get your tickets for next year. It's sold out this year. Next is Fabian Erici, principal at Norrsken VC, also a very interesting VC, and they can tell us more about their fund and their thesis before diving into the topic. That's all for me. If you want to ask questions, you're welcome to use the Q&A tab at the bottom. That will open the little Q&A box. You can post the questions here. You can upvote the questions, and our host and guest will select the questions they like in the second part of this session. The session lasts for an hour. It is recorded, so you'll be able to watch it later on. And that's all for me. So now leaving the stage to you, Hampus and Fabian.
Thank you. So I'm going to be super quick with my intro, but the brief thing about Pale Blue Dot is we're a super early stage fund. We invest mostly in pre-seed and sometimes in seed, meaning that we often invest in more or less founders going towards the direction. Most, I would say 90+% of the companies we invest in have no revenue. Hopefully they have some kind of prototype, and maybe they have customer agreements or something, or customer discussions. But we have done anything from day zero companies to slightly more mature, and we do all over Europe and US. We do roughly 500,000 to 1.5 million euro, dollar, pound. So that's us. And then if you check our webpage, you can see that we do very, very broad what we think climate is. So that's me. And over to Fabian to give a bit about Norrsken.
Thank you, Hampus. And we take all of the founders that Hampus invest in, and when they have found the direction, we do the follow-on ticket. Now, we are also a Swedish-based impact fund, as we call it. So we do both climate tech, which is probably 80% of our portfolio, but then we also do a bit of healthcare, a bit of social inclusion, and so on. And we are part of a broader ecosystem that is called Norrsken in general, that also runs impact hubs, which are physical co-working spaces. We have now 3, one in Rwanda in Africa, we have one in Barcelona and one in Stockholm, and opening up many more. And then I represent the European investment arm, which is a 320 million euro impact VC. We do seed Series A rounds between 1 and 8 million euros. And yeah, love anything that has to do with energy and how we solve the grid of tomorrow. So I think it will be a very interesting discussion.
Yeah, and I think Fabian and I started talking about this a couple of weeks ago, and I think that all of us know that naturally energy is the biggest pollutant. It is like energy generation, of course, like when you go from fossil fuels. But I think a discussion Fabian and I have had a couple of months and weeks, and of course in our respective funds quite a lot, is the fact how the grid changes and how we need to kind of support the grid from growing from a very, very, of course, fossil fuel-based grid to a green grid, but there are so many more aspects of that. So the plan for this session is a bit to bring up how we view this market, and then hopefully have quite a lot of Q&A from you. And we hope to spark some new ideas of startup ideas, and then hopefully having lots of good conversations and questions from you guys. But I can just say some of the background so you get into understand where we're coming from. If you think about the grid 100 years ago when it was created, energy production was completely centralized. We created energy in one place and then pushed all the electrons out. And that is how electricity was made many years. So completely centralized production and then pushing it out. And of course, it was all fossil fuel based, and now it's shifting. And not only is it now shifting to green sources that, of course, have some base load like nuclear. That, you know, is a discussion from between different people how green that is, but you can definitely say that it's not polluting fossil fuels. And then you have solar, wind. Then you have hydro as well, which is also baseload. These, the two here in the middle, the solar and the wind, are intermittent. They go up and down, depending on the weather. And the headache with that is two. Not only does it mean that the number of electrons goes in up and down, that can happen, but the other problem is that energy generation is no longer in one place. It actually, as you know, with solar and wind, they're all over the place. So suddenly the whole production is decentralized from all the different places. So essentially, if you just think about that shift, completely centralized production, pushing electrons from one place, to energy generated by lots of different places and production going up and down. That is a crazy challenge for the grid, which was something that was built not only a long time ago, but also designed for centralized production. So that's the topic we're going to talk about today. And Fabian and I have many links and thoughts about what we think is interesting and not interesting, and, you know, how to actually tackle this market. But I think that's the base for coming in. I'll leave the sort of comment to you, Fabian, and like if you want to have a part of your thesis, or if you want a certain comment or where we're starting.
No, I think that's also my kind of the base layer of why we think this industry is so interesting, because it is an industry that is massive, both in terms of impact and size, but also that is very rapidly changing. And I think one maybe a little bit more positive spin to what is also changing and what creating more opportunities, that we also go from a very analog grid to a very digital grid. In Sweden, we have now 99% smart meter penetration, for example. I know that is not the case in all markets, but we are going to a more digital grid that also opens up for new solutions. And as I see it, this is very much like a traditional supply and demand problem, where we've had very controllable supply generation, where you can, if the demand increase, you also increase the generation. But where we go to a industry or a market where demand or supply is not as controllable anymore, but we have more impact on how we can control the actual demand. So that means the whole flexibilization topic that I think is super interesting. So we go from controlling supply to controlling demand in a better way.
And I think that's also a super interesting aspect. I think some questions are already coming in now when people are asking about the decentralized, centralized aspect. I think an interesting thing here is both the point where we started off by that production is decentralized, so solar and wind panels being all over the place. But the other part is the fact that usage, as Fabian is saying, is something that we can go up and down with, which suddenly means that it changes completely the equation of, because suddenly maybe we don't need to produce as much, we can actually reduce it, right? So that is like, it's an opportunity. It's also a huge challenge for the grid, but it's a very interesting opportunity where we could also think about, for example, creating a market and doing trading on it. So that's like what a lot of companies are looking at, thinking, is there a way where we can put big batteries on the grid, for example, where we would be able to charge them when energy is cheap, which technically means that energy is abundant. So like there's a lot of energy, you store that energy, or you can of course store it in other sources. You can store it in hydrogen or anything else. And then you use that energy later when it's harder to produce energy, maybe because, you know, solar and wind are low. So that's like one of the interesting aspects, that we could actually go from a very polluting grid to a very, very green grid, thanks to the fact that we don't have to just turn up the coal plant or something to generate electricity.
And I think if just like sharing a little bit how we view it, and maybe try to structure it a little bit, like in terms of the areas that we think are interesting. So the first one, we already said, like we have a very polluting grid that we need to replace, but at the same time also increase production, because we go into a much more electrified society in general and with a higher GDP and so on. So the first thing we need to invest in is increased production. We have wind, solar, as Hampus said, very kind of mature technologies that needs to scale. We also think there is a need for novel technologies like thermal. I also already see one question in the chat on thermal, fusion, SMR, like all of those technologies also needs investments. Then the second one is what we already touched upon, increased flexibility. How do we actually, how do we make the demand more flexible, and how can we work with both the current assets, but also future assets to make them more flexible? And that also ties into that we need more storage. and more storage technologies. Like lithium ion is great for the short-term storage, maybe up to a day or so, but for longer term, both weekly, even seasonal and yearly storage, there we probably need other solutions that are where we still need to do technological advancements. And then the last one, which I think is very interesting, is that we also need to actually make better use of the electrons we produce. So we need to invest in how, like there are so many low-hanging fruits on how we can increase efficiency in everything from your household to many of the industries out there that has been quite neglected, because like electricity has been relatively cheap, or at least it's always been the same price, more or less. Whereas now it's very much fluctuating and also becoming more and more expensive in many regions. So reducing your actual electricity consumption per unit produced, whatever that is also something we can do a lot with.
And it's a good point you're saying about storage there, because I think for a lot of people, there's one part is like how to produce, as you said, but one part is store, and a lot of people immediately go to batteries. And as you said, when we think about batteries, we think about lithium-ion batteries. But there are so many ways. Like there are lots of places in the world where currently we're pumping up water and to lakes that are further up to actually let it roll down and using hydropower. So literally, energy storage is pump water up, and there are a lot of very interesting, peculiar initiatives of lifting large cement slates and then slowly being able to drop them down, or pressure that you later spin a little propeller on. So there are a lot of initiatives of just thinking about how do we actually just store energy out in the grid when production is cheap so that we later can use it there. And that's something where there is not that much innovation as is needed. So there's a lot of interesting things we can do. There's also a kind of almost obvious thing, as you said, Fabian, about the fact that because households are being electrified so heavily, and of course not only household, also industries and everything, there's an enormous amount of energy storage, and I'm putting big air quotes that, in actually being able to turn on and off electrical vehicle charging, or heating the water in your heat pump. Like as you said, Fabian, with demand response, it's super interesting to think about the fact that every single household that is switching from an oil pan that is heating water to doing that electrically is actually now an opportunity to actually use as a battery in the grid. Because now the utility or whoever controls that heat pump can now heat that water 1 degree Fahrenheit, Celsius, Kelvin, maybe it's better to talk about, and then eat more than you need, and then use so that you don't have to heat in 6 hours or 12 hours or 18 hours or something, which is just a way of storing energy. And that's a thing where you actually don't need more batteries suddenly put on the grid. So there are a lot of those interesting ways. And right now, there are more than 100 million of those devices in Europe out on the grid that allows us to store energy. So there are a lot of those things that I think most people who go about it are thinking about as fairly brute force, of we just have to build lots of new nuclear plants or lots of new solar panels or lots of something. We probably do. And I think also to your comment, Fabian, which I think is a very good societal point, which is we know that electricity is very well tied to wealth and health. So if we want a society that continues to prosper, we actually need to accept that we need to just produce more electricity, and of course use it smart as well. But we could decide to, no, we're going to cap everything here and not produce more electricity. But that means a lot of things will stall and of course continue to be polluting. So even if you would have a random climate denier saying we don't need to make the grid greener, there is just a purely health aspect of humanity to actually increase energy production, which I think a lot of people just forget. I thought it was great when you said it. It's like one of those things that's easy to be like, yeah, do we actually need more power? Yeah, we need a lot more power, actually.
I think also what is why this is so interesting is also that it is the backbone of the whole climate transition that we need to do. Like without green electricity that is cheap, reliable, and abundant, it will be very, very hard to reach any of the climate goals that we have set out for ourselves. So it's also like it is the backbone and the kind of the if there was one problem to solve, as you said at the beginning, it's quite obvious that it is the most polluting industry, but it's also like the solution to many of the other industries. If we don't have a green electricity, it doesn't matter if we do hydrogen that is just based on coal industry, on the coal grid from the get-go. So we need this is the core of the whole climate transition.
Yeah, and I think that I was thinking also reading one of the questions here. Ranjaran is asking, which of the generation of storage technologies are we most excited about? I can say from Pilbudot's standpoint, I think that what we like is when you can figure out a way which would create something for an industry which is easy. So like, let me explain what I mean. So I think when somebody's trying to create a very intricate solution put on the grid, I always find those like a bit complicated, because like if you want to build a next generation battery, it takes a long time to build. Are you sure you want it on the grid? So I like when you can figure out repurposing of something there. But what I do like is a lot right now, the maritime industry. So if you take boats, big ships they burn absolutely everything, anything. Like you put something in a tank, you burn it. You can put probably just, anything, pillows, whatever, it would just go on the sea, it doesn't matter. And right now, a lot of the maritime industry realized that they would love to switch to using, for example, methanol and later cracking ammonia. But I think it's interesting because methanol is one of those things we actually can extract and create, because methanol is hydrogen and essentially CO2. So there's interesting ways when you think about it. It's like, can you actually take these things out? We don't necessarily want a lot of CO2, as we know, and actually turn it into methanol. And then, of course, when the boats would drive, it would, of course, pollute again because it would burn it. But the nice thing is, like, if you would actually make money on capturing it and getting it back, then that would become a net zero effect of it. So I think that's one where we're excited about and discussing quite a lot. If we can figure out methods where either we plug it into an existing system as it wants it, or we figure out ways we can actually deploy it fairly quickly. We're always a bit hesitant to building pump up lakes or completely novel battery technologies. But I was thinking, Fabian, because you probably looked a lot more, because you also looked at molten salt, like you looked at a lot of like energy and heat storage things over time. So like, what are things that you liked? Because some of these are mature quite a lot.
No, I think it's an interesting question, and kind of the political answer that I will get is that we need them all. So it's like, I'm very much in the camp that energy storage will not be solved by one single solution. We need many, and there are many different purposes where different technologies play a more vital role. So, for example, lithium-ion, where we invested in Northvolt, plays a critical role for the short-term storage for a day or so. Then I actually think that there are potential use cases for also everything from pumped hydro to changing the electricity into molecules like methanol, or you can create the natural gas with electricity, for example, and those kind of more chemical ways to store electricity, which are sometimes much more efficient if you do it over a longer period, or need to transport it a long way. But then also, like, we look at new chemistries for batteries. We look at spinning rotors down deep in the sea. We look at everything between heaven and earth for how we can solve energy storage. But I think that the key thing that we do, and I guess you also do, Hampus, is when you look at these new solutions, it's one, how plug and play are they in the grid? Like, how can you just insert them in the grid and they would work from day one if you solve the underlying technology? And then two, what is the cost of energy storage over time? So how much does it cost to store a unit of energy over a certain period of time, and what is the use case for that then? So those are the solutions. One thing that I'm particularly interested in right now is industrial heat. So like looking at how we can store industrial heat in good ways to decarbonize some of those processes.
Yeah, I agree, and that's one of those. I think one of the things we're thinking about a lot, also maybe to just set the context for a listener, is that we're both venture funds. And I think that one thing, if you're a venture fund, you kind of look as like what you said, Fabian. Of course, you want like the best, techno-economics over time. But I think one thing that we're fairly obsessed about at Pivot, and I think you're too, is the notion of drag. And what I mean is, like, a lot of times you can come as a company or a startup and find a customer, and you can create quite a complex solution where you do a bit of that and replace this. And somebody asked if we would be interested in looking at multimodal way of solving, for example, ships, like putting sails and using methanol. I think those are great ideas. But the headache is for a company is that if you're giving venture money, you kind of have to be able to scale pretty fast and address the solution. And if you think about an airplane or balloon or arrow or whatever you're thinking about, the more it has stuff sticking out, the more drag it has, the slower it gets. And of course, and I think we think about a startup in that way. If you're like shooting out a cannonball or tossing a snowball or something, it has very low drag. So the more you're doing, the more different kind of things your startup has to do to come in. You have to be a bit of consultancy, do this, put on the sales, that just the more complex it becomes, and the more it becomes a professional service company, which is not a bad business, and it can solve a lot of climate issues. But it's very hard to do venture funding wise, where how do you host and use 1, 2, 3, 4, 10, whatever million euros to accelerate this if you have to solve 5 different problems with 6 different teams. So we tend to like solutions that are like, you can see how, for example, you would write on replace, as you said, Fabian, or something where you can see that it's not actually complex to get in for one reason or another. And ideally, it's very clear what the current demand is. There are a lot of solutions that have something which is super impressive over time, but it's very unclear who the customer is. And that's always really complicated, because then this is a science project looking for a customer.
No, I agree. And maybe one thing that you always spell out, Hampus, when we chat, is that it also has to make business sense. You can't do it only from a sustainability angle. So if you are pitching any of these solutions, it has to be what we call, and I don't know if it was you who taught me this, Hampus, but like the devil's test. It would like the I don't know who we take as the stereotype, but some rich oil mogul, would they still invest in this technology because it made business sense? So that's like the angle that sometimes are forgotten when you speak to only impact-minded people. That not all everyone out there is thinking the same way that we do.
And I think the way we discussed it quite a lot is like, let's say we invest in a company, and then, you know, Fabian invests, like Pivot does it, and then, you know, Fabian and Norrsken does the next round. The headache is that if we're always going to do the relay race and finding a climate believer and going on, there will just be very limited capital. So the ideal we always find is if we invest in a company and then a completely like generic, we don't care about climate or not even necessarily believe about climate, is the one that we invest in next. That is always the best. And then sometimes, you know, the world needs to mature, and sometimes the company needs to mature. But ideally, if you actually want to build an amazingly large company that actually addresses the climate problems, you kind of need to tap into, you know, public markets that like really don't give a shit about climate a lot of times.
No, very true. And then maybe one other angle to it that we have been discussing quite a bit lately, and frankly, I'm not 100% sure exactly on how to think about it. It's like, how do we actually make best use of the relatively scarce resources of renewable energy that we have today? So like the typical example is, should we use massive amounts of electricity to capture CO2 from there, when we can instead just pump that into the grid and have a little bit less coal in kind of the grid electricity? And that goes not only into those technologies, but also a lot of like we had a few questions here on e-methanol, on e-natural gas, and so on. Those are also quite electricity intensive processes that would require a lot of green electricity to scale. And as long as we don't have 100% green grid, does it then make sense? I don't know. Like it's a tough question. How do you think about that, Hampus?
No, definitely. And something I think is also the question is how close you are to the grid. Like if you're able to, there was a question about even more decentralized and off-grid power generation. I think if you're, it wasn't 10 years ago now, it was slightly less, but there was a conversation, I think it was 6 years ago, that generating Bitcoin from solar would be a quote unquote energy storage. The headache is with that thesis is, for me at least, is the fact that when you have Bitcoin, you can't really use it to power your radiators at home. So it's a bit of a contrived analogy, but I kind of definitely understand it. Like if you create energy on small islands or places where there's not a lot of people and store it, then I think that the conversion makes a lot of sense. But if you're in the center of the grid and like in a country, then you probably should use those electrons right away. Storing them, I think there's always a loss in storage. Like it doesn't really matter how you think about it. It's like if you can use it right now, it's probably much more efficient. And I think another angle to think about this, which you brought up earlier, Fabian, is also the fact that sometimes efficiency is actually the most interesting one. Can you actually reduce the amount of electricity being used? And we see that quite a lot if you look at big industrial, where like you're looking at a current process that when the customer walks through how they're currently melting steel or creating cement or something, it is so absurd. You feel like, is this a 100-year-old process? And you realize, yes, it is the 100-year-old process. That's why nobody's actually thought about it. So a lot of these areas where you can come in with like an AI hat on it, when an AI, and my degree is actually in machine learning and control theory, and a lot of AI problems are just optimization problems. So a lot of these is like, can you actually just think about how you melt the steel slightly better, or how do you produce the cement slightly better? And better, of course, is more efficient, cheaper. 99% of the time, usually that means lower energy. So it's like that is something that I think that both of us would love to find more of. It's just like finding things when you take a process to just make it cheaper, better, faster, stronger. Then Scrooge McDuck and the climate is both happy.
Mm-hmm. But then the counter argument to that is that we have seen kind of the cost curves of solar. I've talked to a lot of entrepreneurs that I think I love that vision of like saying, we believe that solar will be dirt cheap. In 15 years, solar will be dirt cheap. It'll be exist in abundance. So we don't care so much about efficiency in terms of energy conversion, because we believe that we will get access to like a lot of very cheap solar energy. We more care about like decreasing the capex need, making it quite like non-optimal process, but with low capex and therefore low energy efficiency in what they turn. If we take the example of carbon storage again, like you use massive amounts of energy for doing the carbon storage, but then you have very low capex in the technology that you utilize. That's like that's the other side of that equation. Like, will we have dirt cheap solar and potentially other technologies so that it actually makes sense to use energy inefficient processes to solve some of these problems?
Yeah, and I think that's like Michael asked the question here. Like the grid right now has been a lot of up and down 3 years. Is that going to develop? 5-7 years outlook. Totally on your view here, Fabian. I think that the price of solar is going down so drastically, and honestly, the price of wind is looking very good as well. I think nuclear is one of those where nuclear is a good base load if done correctly, but the headache with it is that there are a lot of, it's both politically very complicated, but also price-wise, it is not that easy unless we can make very small modular reactors. Of course, fusion would open that up. And I think that fusion is not 5 to 7 years away, even if it's always 5 to 7 years away. And I think small modular reactors, they're here, but they're also not here. So I think that the coming years, we won't have, if we're figuring out fusion or small modular reactors, they're not going to replace more than 1% of the grid the coming years. So the grid will be super unstable for many years, and hopefully we can switch the base load to better and better ways of geothermal or nuclear powered, but that will not happen. It's going to take a bit of time for that one.
No, definitely. And also maybe referring to Michael's question there, like not only the energy is up and down, but also what we investors think is interesting is up and down, and that like ties in what we have seen, at least in Europe, is a lot about, and also in the US, is a lot regarding the regulatory landscape that has such a big impact. Also, like the macro landscape. So when the war in Ukraine happened, when Russia invaded Ukraine, energy prices spiked. Suddenly everyone was talking about the what is your energy bill? How do you optimize your energy around like dinner tables? That had not been a topic before that. And now it's almost gone again, because now energy prices are down. They're lower than they were pre-war. So it's a lot about fluctuating regulatory/macro landscape as well. We see the same in heat pumps that had a lot of subsidies a couple of years ago, including high gas prices, which made people want to exchange their gas boilers, but then the gas prices dropped, and it didn't make economic sense to replace your gas boiler with a heat pump anymore. And then demand in a very large market dropped by up to 50-80% in some smaller markets. And that is just like crazy. That such a big market to drop 80% year over year, it's very few markets where that can happen. So that makes it a bit scary. But my strong belief is that we will have a turbulent market, but trending in the kind of the upwards direction for many of these technologies. But it will be a quite bumpy ride.
Yeah, and I think that some of that, of course, as you said, subsidies, some is a tech maturity, some is grid maturity. Like these are all interacting. And I think that we see it right now, how actually when we talk to American companies and American investors, how interesting it's the fact that the election is in a couple of weeks affects people's minds so heavily. So sometimes when we talk to US VCs about an American company, they're more or less saying, I'm going to stay out of this for another 4 weeks. And even if they have nothing to do with something which is currently under a climate bill or something, and this is even not a change in regulation, it's a fear about a change in regulation. So like it is one of those things where it's hard to guess. David is asking a question that I think that Fabian and I have been discussing. So he asking about, are these more venture returns or private equity? And I think that's actually a question that Fabian and I talked about quite a lot during the prep, and was just like discussing, because I think both of us, both Belbodot and Norrsken, has done a couple of investments where you have to squint and ask yourself, are they private equity or are they venture? And we're quite excited about that area. And I think it's something where we've done 4 companies currently, and they're not the typical kind of quote unquote climate tech companies. It's a company that we have a last mile delivery company called Hive. We have a company called Ember, which is a bus company in England. And we have a company, installation company called Valm in Germany. And all these companies are like, they look kind of like small businesses, if you think about it. And I think one of the reasons we believe they're venture is that you can use a lot of their interesting technology to scale these extremely quickly and with much, much better margin that you could like 30, 40 years ago. So I think that, but it is, to David's question, I think some of these things, it's like edge cases. And it's a conversation we had during PEP. I don't know if you have an interesting answer there, because like we said, maybe we shouldn't bring this up. It's too complicated. But now when David is asking.
No, I think you're right, and I actually think it can be both. Like also, David, I saw your second comment there. Like maybe it is VC in the first couple of rounds, but then it becomes PE, and maybe that is not a problem. I have no problem with a PE coming in at a later stage when we have taken down a lot of risk, also increased the value by a lot, and captured a lot of the value already. And I would even take it one step further and ask: is it VC, is it PE, or is it infra even? We even lower return expectations. We've done now at least 3 bets, which we expect infra funds to come in and finance at least parts of those businesses. And there we think we can, we have seen it already working in a few businesses where you have a very complex, unfortunately, and then quite hard to understand the capital stack, where you have different types of funding for different layers of the business, which hopefully enables us to have VC returns on the top co, which also takes the majority of the early stage risk, where we have more project financing and also infra financing for the underlying assets, which are more infra-like. So I think you can also be creative in the way you finance those kind of solutions. But we have seen so far great returns on those kind of cases.
And some of these things are so tied. Some of these are and also all of these, honestly, are so tied to economical market. If you think about the wider lens of things that both Fabian and I invest in, sometimes they're not so perfectly connected to money. The interesting thing with all of these things is because electrons are money. If you can store them, create them, reduce it, you are essentially moving money. And I think that Sergey is asking a question here about like the demand flexibility market and the models around it. The interesting thing with that is that when you are creating demand flexibility of like reducing the load of the grid, you're essentially talking about money or load. It is a market. And I think that currently we have day ahead spot markets in a lot of countries. And that's something where the arbitrage, quote unquote, like because it is a financial market, will probably decrease over time. And there are going to be quite a lot of those interesting with like local flex markets, or for example, nodal pricing with like grid cells or something, and like variable grid fees. Because of the grid's tendency to become decentralized, there are a lot of these going to be pockets. And you think about it, if you're in London or New York or another big city and you want to take an Uber, there is surge prices. Like, it's not that strange. Like, are lots of cars right now and you easily want to go somewhere? And that's the thing. It's going to be the same with the grid. And it's very strange today that in certain countries there's very, very large grid cells. It's enormous grid cells. And it's very strange because the electrons are not actually produced around here or stored around here. So that's probably going to change to actually become a more, quote unquote, financially economically efficient market in the economist word of efficiency there.
I think also there are so many interesting phenomena around when we talk about these, when we see such an increase in renewable and uncontrollable, as we've been saying many times, energy generation. We see things like the duck curve in California, which means that like people are actually putting solar panels facing west, which means that you actually produce less energy than you could optimally, but you produce during the night when there is not so much solar energy in the grid. So you get higher prices. It's as Hampus said, this is just financial markets that could be even more efficient. Also thinking about that, where we started, like this grid has been built out for very centralized and plannable production. So it's not fit for purpose for this kind of production. So also from the grid perspective, there is a big incentive to actually enable more local grids, so that you don't have these kind of congestions. For example, in Sweden, we have a very clear example of almost all of the production happens up in north. A lot of the consumption happens down in south. So we just have like a massive bottleneck in the middle. And these kind of things can also be helped by these flexible assets.
Yeah, there is a wonderful question I need to ask you, Fabian, because I think you want to dismiss it. But Steve here is asking, what's your view on Northvolt?
No, we are a small investor and hope for the best, but I can't say anything more than that right now.
I needed to ask you because I think it was great to have like live trade stock picking conversations here on the radio.
Exactly. You should invest, Steve. I think it's a good one.
It's a good one, exactly. I think, but it is an interesting conversation because if you think about it, think about everything today which is fossil fuel based. I mean, so many of these things, price well to wheel, will be switched to electrons. And it's very hard to understand the trillions of dollars right now that are either power generation or storage. It's something which is polluting and, crazy enough, is more expensive. Like if you look at a lot of transportation, which is a sector both Fabian and I, of course, are looking quite a lot at. The funny thing about that is like, for a lot of use cases, every year, more and more is obviously cheaper with electrical vehicles. There are still use cases where it's really complicated, long distance or very, very heavy or something like that. But everything short range is absolutely electric. And it's crazy because that is one of those things that we don't talk about enough. It's the fact of it's well to wheel. And of course, it's going to be exactly the same here. It is going to be the price from well to heat or light or whatever. And a lot of these things, they're just going to be so much pricier using electrons than using dead dinosaurs that have been compressed over millions of years.
And also, like just looking at the simple physics of the energy efficiency. I don't know the numbers in a combustion car, but I think it's somewhere between 50% ish is my man guess here. But whereas electric car has 90+% in just the energy conversion. So it's just like it's just physics that it makes sense. And I think maybe one more aspect, if I tie back to the Northvolt question, that I think will be more and more interesting going forward, is that cheap green electricity will be such a big enabler of large industries of tomorrow. We already see it in north of Sweden, where we have Northvolt, we have H2 Green Steel, building a steel plant out of hydrogen. We have a similar one that is called Hybrid, and a few more popping up because they have access to cheap, green, and reliable energy. And this is kind of this is why you place the, I don't know, coal mines close to or coal plants close to the coal mines. And we also see the same in Europe. I think Spain and Sweden, or the Nordics, are the two areas where we have most investments in kind of energy demanding technologies. And these will be hubs of the industries of tomorrow, driven by this access to green cheap electricity. Like that is also something interesting to see how it shifts the landscape of industrial production.
Which is also, I think, interesting. So I live in the south of Sweden. Fabian, it's like the mid here. And as Fabian said, the north of Sweden is when you have the cheap energy production. There is an interesting problem in the south of Sweden because, like, right now, there are a lot of companies who want to set up here because of the access. It's just closer to, Germany and England and everything naturally because further south. But they usually cannot do that if they're energy intensive industries, which is a lot of these problems, as we talked about, are also political. And politicians, of course, are trying to be reelected and they want to create a lot of jobs. And interesting enough, like in industrial jobs require quite a lot of electricity. So actually being able to secure electricity production is a very kind of politically well-aligned conversation, because there are a lot of politicians that would love local industries, but local industries means either a very mature grid, great energy storage, or local energy production. And that's something that it's easy to to think about, like only the climate parties that think about this, but every single party is thinking about how to get their constituents employed. And that means somehow getting jobs that require electricity. Not everybody works in an office, naturally. And I was thinking here, Nicole asks a question which I think is fit for you, Fabian. I was asking, what key messages have you found resonate most when asking for investment in new energy solutions? I don't know if Nicole means energy production there, but like I would love to try it on you with energy production. Nicole has to specify me something, because like at least for us, if somebody comes with us with a novel energy production, we're usually fairly slow, I would say, to be super excited.
I think it's always like it's a quite simple like risk reward calculation that goes on in our kind of simple investor brains, which is like how de-risked is the technology and how big is the reward if we actually crack the remaining pieces of that technology. What is very good in both good and bad in the energy industry, that it's like the the commodity of all commodities. So as soon as you can produce for a lower price than your competitors, then you will have an instant demand that is infinite. So we need to see, okay, what will be the price that you are expected to produce at, and what is the risk to take you there? Because this is not a market. In many other cases has like a much clearer market risk. Here we don't see it as a market risk. So those are the two questions that we typically ask. It's quite simple. And then the third one would be then like, how easy is it to plug in? Like, where do you plug in? Do you need a lot of like very, for example, if we look at the SMR, do you need supply chains of different types of rare earth metals and so on? And also, how politically sensitive is it? So is this something where we have a clear pen stroke risk, where someone can just like write the name on a bill and then you're banned to make business? So that's also something that we are a little bit scared about.
I think that Tongchu is asking a question about data centers, which makes me realize that we haven't actually talked about AI and compute quite a lot. And Tongchu's question is about using thermal energy storage to like help the grid, waste heat recovery and everything. I think that both of us are probably fairly keen and interested in looking at data centers. Data centers are kind of funny if you think about it. It's like massive places where they use a lot of electrons that get really, really warm. So obviously it's a great way to actually think about efficiency and heat recovery and a lot of those things. But another thing which I never thought that in my life I would see a big corporate opening up 3 Mile Island or any other nuclear power plant, and that just happened. Like it is, is it less than a month ago that Microsoft put in money to start 3 Mile Island, and the reason they did it is because they need that energy because of big data centers. So one of the weird things about the whole AI, compute, everything is that it's like when we thought about the increased energy production we needed before, that was intense. When you add like big compute and large language models, that just goes up so rapidly that it's unfathomable to understand when you build like these massive data centers. So that's one thing that, at least for me, if you would have added me on the list of things I betted on in 2024, I would have never betted on that somebody would open a nuclear power plant this year at least. So I think that's something interesting, that like this can shift so quickly, to your point, Fabian, about, hey, there's a company that needs the electrons here now. Like this is a clear demand, there's a clear use case. And I think the AI is one of those use cases, which also gets back to the question about decentralization. Because one of the weird things about compute is that you can put it anywhere. You can literally just find a place on the planet which is fairly politically stable, and it's not going to be a war zone, and you can just say, we'll put a data center there if it's cheap electricity, because you don't need a lot of labor either. You can literally say, here in Alaska is a great place, there's not a lot of people. The problem with Alaska, it's very cold, so that might be useful for one part of it, that you don't need heat, like heat, even cooling as much, but energy generation is going to be hard. So I think that's one thing that at least really threw me off, thinking about how the global map really changed.
Mm. And also for data centers, which we think is one of the most interesting aspects of energy right now. As you said, it will be one of the largest users of energy going forward. There is also so many low-hanging fruits or semi-low-hanging fruits where you can invest in efficiency. Data centers or compute in general has been only about increasing performance, or almost only about increasing performance. But we also reached a point where the only way you can actually increase performance right now is if you actually reduce energy or invest in more cooling or better cooling. So we have, for example, invested in a company that I'm very excited about called Submer, doing submersive cooling of data centers. So it's literally putting your racks in a bathtub and with a slightly more sophisticated liquid, and cooling it with liquid instead of air, which just makes it much more efficient because it's liquid has much better energy cooling aspects.
I think anybody who's a big gamer has definitely tried to figure out to put their game computer in some kind of liquid cooling to not live in a sauna when they're playing games. I at least have. John is asking, is asking a question which I think is interesting. Microgrid, grid interactive, demand response have so far struggled to deploy at scale. How do you will see the unlock of the adoption? I think that at least for me, demand response is something which I think is being unlocked now. Like we see that just flowing out in markets. And I think the biggest thing there is, of course, spot prices. Like before you have spot prices, it's the utility that bears the complete brunt of it. The spot pricing produces the consumer as well. So there's a great aligned incentives. But microgrid is something that we've been looking quite a lot and trying to figure out exactly that question that you're asking, John, which is, how do you actually, how do we kick off microgrids? Like, what do we do? Because right now, the ones we've seen are usually in rural places where it's hard to actually connect to a grid or something. And we haven't seen that many in, in Europe, for example. There are a couple of interesting initiatives in the UK, but I don't know, have you seen anything about microgrids, Fabian?
No, it's also been one of those topics that we have been monitoring for quite some time, where it seems hard to get it really off the ground. It's like the overall grid is working well enough still. The incentives to go on a microgrid in kind of semi-functioning area is not that big, and therefore we haven't just seen the kind of the need to go on microgrids. I think there's an interesting use case also for industrials, where you might have an easier time to deploy, like in these industrial parks, where you could share the energy assets across not only your own industrial production, but maybe your closest neighbors that might have a different type of need that matches very well with the energy production that you can collectively do, or you could have more of an industrial microgrid instead of only focusing on what has been, well, at least what we have seen mainly in our deal flow is these kind of urban areas where you try to pool up with your neighbors. I think that could be a good first use case for it.
Yeah, but that's actually the thing. I think that consumers are also amazing because you can always gather 10 of them. But if you actually want to scale something, you usually need that Scrooge McDuck CFO who's really interested in saving money. I think we've seen that so many times. We invested in a couple of companies that started out with like a B2B idea, but they had a bit of a consumer angle of thinking Airbnb for blah, 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 something. And then their average contract value went from mid-size to humongous over just 12 months because they just realized like selling to massive enterprises is actually not that much harder versus selling to individual consumers and getting them to go out and switch stuff on their own. And I think that is really tricky. Laura's asking a question that I think that I really need to like just essentially discuss about. She's asking if we'd see interesting use cases for generative AI in climate tech that have real climate impact potential, which is more than the additional energy and emission costs. My answer is that sadly that doesn't matter. Like it's like I wish we could say that this generative AI trend, we can figure out ways to use it for climate. We probably can. We might can. This will happen. Like right now, every single company on the planet is thinking about how they're using Gen AI or LLMs to solve their problems, which means they're just using more and more data centers, which means that we just have to address the problem. So I think many of these solutions, like we just have to go in and realize, we could all say, oh, let's just like getting everybody to stop eating cows. Do that before 9 a.m. Before lunch, getting everything to nuclear. It doesn't work that way, right? Like we wish we could figure out solutions, but people will do this way. And I have at least found here and there, but it's so tricky. I think that there are so many things that we can use ML for in one way or that. But I don't think that's going to solve any of our problems, essentially.
I think also it's so hard to say what the impact of generative AI is, because like the use cases it can also be used for are very disruptive in like the way that it can create impact. We invested in one very early stage kind of large language, I don't know if you want to call it that, model for chemistry that could unlock the like, I don't know, the next solvent that makes the carbon capture actually economically viable. But it uses a lot of energy before it gets there. It might not ever get there. But like it can be so, it doesn't, it's not a simple equation where you say, okay, it's consumed this amount of energy, it saves that amount of energy. Those solutions are typically not that easy.
Yeah, like very much. We have the same. We invest in a company called Phytoform that essentially is, sorry if Will and Nick hears me now, ChatGPT for plant genomics. So it allows you to actually like figure out and design plant genomics and create, potatoes that you can be transported or higher yields and stuff like that. That is just like essentially a massive large language model that is trying to figure out how to rewrite the genomics of a plant, which is something which I think it's going to be a massive climate impact. Some of that climate impact actually might not be reduced carbon. Some it might, of course, reduce waste, but some it might be just food shortages. How do you actually create enough food for the planet in places where there isn't food? I think many of the problems we face in the energy market and in the food market are not problems of price at production. It's actually distribution, which is the hardest challenge. Like, how do we actually get the food or the electrons to where we want them without losing too much of the value? And I think that's one of the really, really tricky questions. And I think that one of the things that we sometimes think about, which is so complicated with this, is that let's say we create an amazing solution that makes energy cheaper. Like if we just, let's say we take nuclear or we take storage or something, if that drives down the price of electrons, that actually is hurting your own business model. Because if your business model is selling electrons for a high price, if you now drive down the price, when your technology becomes prolific, your margins actually reduce. And that's something that we haven't stopped us from investing, but it's something which sometimes it just pause and makes me worried when I was like, oh shit, if this company actually works and takes over, their margins are gone. And I think we see that currently with solar, right? Like it feels like being a solar producer might not actually be the best business model venture. Being a solar installer is maybe maybe not the best. Being, where do you want to be in these markets? And I think that's a conversation we quite have a lot. Where do you want to be in heat pumps? Where do you want to be in solar? Where do you want to be in wind? Where do you want to be in nuclear? Where do you want to be in storage? Short term, long term. What are your thoughts?
I think one prime example of that is the flexibility markets, especially what has been very lucrative, financially lucrative in the last couple of years, these short-term flexibility markets, where we see like as soon as there comes not a huge, but like a certain supply for those kind of services on the market, those prices will plummet. So like it's also like if our companies succeed, they will also decrease their margins. So it's one of those margins or markets where we have a very clear supply-demand effect, which is very drastic, especially with these smaller markets that then can expand to something bigger.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the good part here is that I find a lot is that it's funny how the world is so different. There are a lot of questions on the chat asking, how do we do this in Pakistan? How do you think about this in the US? How do you think about this in Europe? I think it's super fascinating. If you just look at the map where heat pumps make economical sense, that map changes naturally with, the price of electricity, price of natural gas, how cold the countries are, how well insulated the buildings are. And then if you say how, like, all of these solutions, like, they're so unevenly distributed. It's very, very, like, as soon as you come in with a thing, right now, 2024 might be amazing to do in Ireland, Netherlands, Germany, and Sweden, Finland, Denmark or something. But those are kind of the best countries, and you should probably not go to Italy. And there are other things that are amazing, like Spain, Italy, like solar production obviously is way better. And I think it's so that's the thing I like a lot about this, is that there are opportunities that maybe they're born in the wrong market. Like maybe this thing is kind of good in Germany, but if you were able to deploy it in Spain, that would be amazing. This is actually like way better margins in Spain. And I think that's something that I find so fascinating about the fact that I think you have the same, of course, that we span many, many countries, that we actually can look and pick up solutions and put them somewhere else.
And what I was not aware before started looking into this market is how different, quite similar countries can work in the energy markets. If we take the example again of Sweden and Germany, Sweden has one of the highest penetration of heat pumps. We have 99% penetration of smart meters, as I said before, whereas Germany is on the total other side of the spectrum, even though they have very similar kind of base circumstances around. It's a developed country with kind of the same climate, but it doesn't have hydropower. So that's like the main difference to Sweden. And it can vary so much. It also makes our job a little bit harder because you need to be very careful with how you think about the solutions that in other markets than your home market. And maybe the final point on that is we talked a little bit about microgrids. I think it's also very important to invest in actually cross-regional connections, because we have a lot of surplus production in some areas where when the wind blows, when the sun shines, and so on. Whereas other markets are very undersupplied. So there with interconnections, and especially if we now talk about the US, which I know quite little about still, the interconnection just between states is so fragile. So like you can have very cheap energy in California, but the surrounding states has some completely different circumstances.
And that's an interesting thing to think about as well, is that weather, solar and wind are things that really depend on where the sun is. Both really depend on where the sun is. And it's a tricky thing for Europe, which is slightly more of a north-south continent, like if you just think about the width of it, which means that for us, like we don't have that many time zones when the sun comes up and the sun goes down. So if you want to sell energy from Poland to Ireland, sure, that's a bit, but there's a lot of water in between. If you want to do it from New York to California, you actually quite have a lot of time. which means that if you actually had really good energy, like transportation, you could actually really make use of the renewables much better. So, and of course, even more so if you look at like Europe versus like, if you could do something from Ireland to Beijing, you could do something extraordinary, because then suddenly you would actually have land that you can transport for an enormous part. So I think that's one of those things, like, can we actually update the grids? Like, what can we do here? Can we transport other ways? Do we have to dig down the cables nowadays to avoid, wind issues? There's so many things in just like making the grid like a 21st century thing. Right now, I think it is like, it's a very old thing that we're still relying very, very heavy on. I have one more question from John, which I think is, or Gon, sorry, I'm mispronouncing it again, probably. Gon is asking about upfront costs, especially in residential, small commercial. Like, it's a problem that I think is clearly political in some ways, that if you actually want to upgrade your home and heat pumps and everything, is there a subsidy in certain countries, or do you do it out of pocket? I think it's a solution which we've seen a bit, which I think is very fascinating, is there's a very large incentive for banks to essentially make you invest in your own home. Like, those are the absolutely best customers. If you want to buy a car or go travel around the world, maybe you're not the customer we want. But if you're the customer that actually would upgrade your home, insulate it, put in heat pumps, that's a very clear sign you're going to stay here for a long time and, pay your bills. So that's something where I think there are going to be a lot of solutions thinking about financing from more or less regular banks. I like, again, it really depends on where you are, both politically and geography and everything. But I think that's the thing we're going to see way more of coming up.
I couldn't agree more. And also because it's two reasons why banks are interested in that. One is that they need to future-proof their mortgage portfolios. Households that you sell that are not fit for purpose and so on, they will decrease in value going forward. And the second one, which is interesting, is that they have within their scope of emissions also their mortgage portfolio. So they need to both understand how polluting their mortgage portfolio is, and to meet their climate goals, they also need to decarbonize their mortgage portfolio. And then they also need to incentivize these kind of green upgrades in their mortgage portfolios. So I think that is, they have all the incentives to actually invest in those kind of technologies.
Awesome. I think we're wrapping up, and Ben is going to jump in and tell us we have to wrap up now, I guess. So that's what's happening.
You read my mind. Well, I would love to keep you guys going, because you really cover a lot of ground. That I was saying backstage that you actually have a very high signal to noise ratio in this session. So that's fantastic. And also you touch upon many of the complexities of the grid, its interconnection, the connection to generation, storage, the problem that how fragmented it is, how to upgrade it, who's in charge of upgrading it. And that's definitely the case in Europe, or of course in America also is a big topic. And in the rest of the world, in some cases, the grid is not even reliable. I think that's all the time we have for today, but we should probably do that again sometime, and maybe covering some other topics as well. So to give some orientation, so I'd like also to thank the audience for the many great questions you guys asked. So I know you had many more in the pipeline, but that's all the time we have today, unfortunately. So there are more other sessions for breakouts by other partners taking place in the rest of the week. If you haven't signed up for the main conference, the Climate Tech Summit, you're welcome to do so at the website. And if you're a startup or an investor, a startup founder or an investor, we also are running a matchmaking event, a virtual matchmaking in which you're welcome. And that runs the entire week. We have currently over 700 investors and 900 startups signed up. So it's a big crowd, but it's also quite well organized with lots of filters. So you can find, if you're a founder, which investor is a good match for you. And if you're an investor, you can also filter the startups according to the categories they're in, the geography, the stage, and have a lot of details about them. So that's all for now. So you can find that on the sosvclimatetech.com website /matchup. And that's all for now. Thank you very much to both of you for this very great and detailed session, and looking forward to more opportunities for more sessions.
Thanks a lot, Ben. Thanks for doing this as well. It's awesome.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Ben.
Thank you.
Thank you all, everyone.